يأكل نبل كلنا نسلامنا يأكل نبل كلنا نحكن قوامنا يأكل نبل كلنا ونعبيتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا وهدتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا غرعتنا زقرم
Okay. Well, thank you for our followers, Global Yiakl. Today, I am sitting down with the fantastic Professor Kjetil Trumbull. Welcome. Kjetil Trumbull is a professor of Peace and Conflict Studies, International Studies at Bjerg University College, Oslo, and a managing director of Oslo Analytica, a research and advisory company. Trumbull was a professor of human rights at the University of Oslo until 2012, when he resigned to prioritize his engagement in conflict resolution, reconciliation, and policy advice to the international agencies. Trumbull's doctoral degree is in political anthropology from London School of Economics and Political Science. Trumbull has undertaken long-term anthropological fieldwork in Eritrea, Ethiopia, and Zanzibar, in addition to a shorter field studies in a dozen of African countries. Trumbull has published broadly on issues of human rights, transitional justice, peace, reconciliation, and conflict studies, democratization and election, political anthropology, and African studies. Trumbull has served as an advisor to political reconciliation process and international peace mediation initiatives, as well as in regards to the human rights concern in several African countries. He has headed and participated in election observer mission to numerous African elections. Trumbull has an extensive experience as an international consultant to bilateral and multilateral agency. So welcome. I don't know if that introduction does any justice to the work you have done over the last 30 years in Horn of Africa. So I'm going to start my conversation with something personal to tell us what really inspired you to study about the region. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you so much for inviting me to join you on your show to talk about some of my favorite countries. And why did I end up studying, researching Eritrea and Ethiopia? Well, during my dissertation work, which started in the late 1980s, as an anthropologist, that's the only time you can kind of choose freely where do you want to go to study a culture very different from your own, if you like. And growing up in Norway, in social democratic Norway in the late 60s, 70s, early 80s, you know, most peaceful, stable, well-off society in the world, more or less, I wanted to experience something radically different, something the quite opposite of how I had lived until then. Meaning I was looking for countries, areas where there was an active war, where it was macro society stress factors like famine and hunger and migration. And I had a particular interest of studying the ideologies of nationalism and recruitment to resistant armies or liberation armies. And at that time, late 80s, there was a number of countries, both in Africa and Central America, I looked at as possibilities for doing fieldwork. But rather quickly, I homed in on Eritrea and the Eritrean liberation struggle. Also with the fact in mind that I thought that this struggle, the Eritrean War of Liberation, was coming to an end. And that's kind of a lifetime opportunity for a politically oriented researcher to see the birth of a new nation, the birth of a new state, and to follow that from the very first time. So, and I timed it perfectly. I think I was among the very, very first foreigners being allowed to enter Eritrea after the fall of Asmara in May 1991. I was originally scheduled to go into the liberated areas in '89 during the war, EPLF granted me research permit to do that. But then and I was on my way a couple of times through Khartoum, but then they stopped me saying that, you know, the military offensives are so and so, we need to take a bit care now, so please wait. And they didn't want me in field during the last phase of the struggle. And I think that was certainly a blessing in disguise, that I came in just after the takeover of Asmara, meaning the whole EPLF apparatus, which had been very professional during the struggle to receive foreigners, foreign journalists, and also a couple of researchers, and introducing them to the kind of ideal society in the field. And the dedication of the fighters and the dedication of the people during the struggle, but also the fact that every foreigner visiting the liberated areas were seconded with an official interpreter and an official handler by EPLF, which is of course natural, but then also all the information you get is filtered through the eyes of the front. So when I arrived just some few weeks during the summer of 1991, EPLF was fully busy to assume control of government, assume control of the territory. And, you know, a strange young Norwegian researcher who had earlier been granted permit, nobody cared about me. I was forgotten, and I could move around alone and get my own assistant interpreter, choose the areas of fieldwork. I settled in a very small village just south of Segeneti in the highlands. And nobody were selecting any of my field studies or any of my informants. So I could settle without them and get in touch with the local people without the control of the front. And that immediately gave me access to a very different kind of discourse than if I had been under the control of an EPLF handler. So that's a brief background on why Eritrea. Purely out of kind of ideological interest for nationalism, but also out of the curiosity, you know, and the privilege I had being growing up in Norway to select to live in a community so very, very, very different than where I came from.
Yeah, I think this is really touching for me to see that. You know, my people are very welcoming of foreigners and really hospitable people. So it's fantastic to hear something outside of this revolution and government and politics, things that really focuses about Eritrean family and their hospitality and their gracious being.
I think, just let me interrupt you on that, because that is actually, that was one of the first issues, or first kind of, how can I explain it, which struck me so deep, the fact that I, coming from a totally well-off society and going to a village just some few weeks after the war, where you had a lot of people being killed. This was kind of that village was liberated just early 1991.
Yeah.
In the front line of the Kamare. And you had people starving, you had injured, you had a terrible situation in terms of food supplies, in terms of basic commodities, in terms of no water, you know, very, very scarcity in that village. But still, as you say, they didn't even ask, they just said, welcome.
Yeah.
They said, where are you from? And I tried to explain, they didn't quite know Norway, but everybody knew this Norway biscuit, yeah, the protein biscuit.
Yes.
So they connected it with a positive spin. And then they gave me a house, a hut, a mud hut in Hidmo in the village, and offered me and shared with me their very, very meager resources of food and drinks without asking for anything back. And, you know, that's such a very, very different way of welcoming strangers than what we used to do here in Norway, where we have all the opportunities to invite anybody into our house and give them whatever they want. But still, during those very dire circumstances, that hospitality, that inclusiveness is what struck me as a fundament of that culture.
That's really exciting to hear and very refreshing. So I'm going to get to today's topic that everyone is really looking forward. And I brought one of my favorite book of yours to really touch point. If you can just kind of give us like a summary of the interconnectivity of the armed struggle in Eritrea during the independence, after the independence, the continued relationship of the TPLF and EPLF, and then later on to PFDJ, that led to a very disastrous war into 1998. Now revisiting a collaboration of similar path with Dr. Abiy Ahmed and Isaias-Abiy. If you can just make a parallel connection, if it has any to it.
Yeah, it's quite an intricate history, and it's often portrayed by journalists and outsiders as very simplistic, kind of surface-based impression, which it is not, obviously. You do have periods of very close collaboration and intimacy between EPLF and TPLF during the struggle, but you also have periods where they had breach of relations and almost went to war against each other during the War of Liberation in the mid-1980s, when you did have the formal breach of collaboration between the two fronts, based on ideological reasons mostly, but also more pragmatic military strategic reasons, which we elaborate in that book you pointed out. When the EPLF and TPLF leadership managed to join in a collaborative framework again at the end of the liberation struggle, so to say, they never got back to a strategic relationship, as it was called. It was then based on a tactical relations, meaning that they had the same objective of toppling the Derg, but they had different ideological reasons to do so, so to say, and they had different visions past that. And you saw that after the fall of the Derg, and you had the interim period from 91 to 93, during that period, both of the two governments were very much preoccupied to gain full territorial control and put up an administration of the country and the governing capacity of the country. But then in 1993, with the formal independence and sovereignty of Eritrea and Ethiopia entered into a full bilateral pact, the Asmara Pact, as it was called, signed in Asmara, which is a full bilateral framework agreement regulating their businesses, economy, trade, culture, sport, defense, and so on, aiming to be very much aligned when they pursued their independent developments. But very quickly after that, already in 1994-95, you saw that framework, which were agreed upon, were not implemented. And certainly one of the biggest challenges that they never really formalized the bilateral ties. The communication went between the two head of states, Meles and Isaias, often a telephone call or a handwritten note. It wasn't institutionalized through the two government structures, through the two foreign ministries, for instance. It wasn't anchored in the bureaucracy. It was kept personalized, which also were one of the key reasons, according to my research and others, for the breakdown of trust. When the relationship between two countries are based on a personalized, opinion-based relationship between two people, when that relationship between two people is broken, the relationship between the two countries are broken. And that, international affairs shouldn't be run like that and isn't run like that in any other country. You have an institutionalization of the relationships through foreign ministries, through ministries of trades, through ministries of finance, regulating currency, regulating customs, regulating citizenship, regulating entries, immigrations, and everything, in order not to make one single item jeopardize the whole bilateral relationship between two countries and two people. That was one of the core reasons for the breakdown and the start of the war in 1998, when Isaias more or less personally ordered the first attack on Badme. As we know from the G13 exposure after the war in 2000, the senior EPLF, PFDJ ministers and generals who then came out criticizing Isaias-Abiy for entering into the war again with Tigray and with Ethiopia. The parallel to today's situation is there, in a sense that the number of meetings between Isaias-Abiy and Abiy Ahmed after April 2018, very little is known about what the genuine discussions are about. There are no open agenda for the meetings. There are no public available minutes of meetings between these two head of states, head of governments. And we don't really know any of the substance of these discussions. Yes, Ethiopia said very early on, and I spoke intimately to Ethiopian government representatives in 98, 99 about, yes, now we have managed to finalize trade agreement, both petty trade cross-border, but also macro bilateral trade. We have managed to sign or to finalize a port agreement. This was already said in 2019. Still, we haven't seen this agreement. Still, we don't know if Eritrea has signed this agreement. Still, we don't know if they are operational or not. And it seems very much to be based on this personalized relationship, this time between Isaias-Abiy as the big brother and Abiy Ahmed as his junior. Can we trust it? Is it institutionalized? Is it anchored bureaucratically, in the bureaucracy in Addis? Well, some of it is, because we know that, but we don't know anything how it is anchored in Eritrea. Is this discussed in the cabinet in Asmara? Does the cabinet actually function? We know the parliament doesn't function. Is the party operational? Where is it anchored in Eritrea? These very, very important issues for the future of Eritrea, of the development of Eritrea, economically, socially, not least defense-wise. Nothing is known. And as usual, Isaias-Abiy keeps quiet, and then he offers an interview once or twice a year where he rambles on more or less incomprehensibly for all listeners. And we have to kind of tweak and analyze every sentence. Is it something hidden here in between, which is try to send some signal or not? Very strange, yeah? And I fear that the current relationship between Asmara and Addis is not sustainable the way it is operating now. It is not sustainable. And we know there are forces within Ethiopia which have different agendas, different interests, different visions of Ethiopia-Eritrean relationships. And we know there are very central political actors in Ethiopia who actually see and talk about Eritrea is coming back to the motherland, finally. That's a dangerous.
Yeah, that's what I was alluding to. In a sense, for me, as an Eritrean or a person who's also lived in Ethiopia in early parts of my life, that pipe dream of Eritrea belongs to us is a very, very scary situation. And I think Eritrea has always stood a threat and sovereignty, both from TPLF and the rest of the Ethiopia, right? Because historically we've seen organizations like opposition forces that have gone to Tigray to really remove Eritrea. The number one destabilizers were TPLF, right? Like they do, for some reason, they didn't want that organization to happen without their control, which kind of helps me to conclude to say they want a leadership in Eritrea that can control, right? Like if TPLF want a leadership in Eritrea that they can control, right? And as well as the other Ethiopia wants a part of an entire water access and Eritrea as part of them, none of them really factoring the desire of Eritrean and Eritrean people. With that said, would you say the sovereignty of Eritrea is at imminent threat, both from a future conflict with Ethiopia, as well as the aggression that could backfire from the new Tigray forces that will try to enter Eritrea to remove Isaias?
Before I come to that, let me just qualify some of your introduction on this topic, because I think, yeah, Ethiopia is a hegemonic state. Ethiopia is the anchor state in the Horn of Africa, bigger than all neighboring states in terms of demography and economy and geography and political weight. And they do have had an enduring interest to control the Horn of Africa, political wise, to be the hegemon of the region, no doubt about that. No matter which regime in Ethiopia has been in power for the last millennia, they've had that interest, yeah? And they continue to have it, obviously. And, you know, that's realpolitik. All hegemonic states have that interest to control their backdoors, so to say. Look at the US and Central America and Latin America interest they have there. Look at Russia and their interest in their neighborhoods. That's how the game is played. But I think we should qualify, and I know that this isn't popular among my Eritrean friends, but still I have to say it, that TPLF has been more or less the only guarantist for continued Eritrean sovereignty after 1993. I'm not saying that TPLF don't have an interest to control Eritrea. I'm saying TPLF has been the only guarantist for a sovereign Eritrea, because they had never entertained an interest to reoccupy Eritrea. And actually Meles used a lot of political capital to defend Eritrea. And certainly after 2000, when Ethiopian forces broke through the Eritrean defense forces and could have marched to Asmara, Meles said, no, we have no interest to do that. And which created a huge backlog to him, so to say, in Ethiopia. And more or less all Ethiopian opposition parties in the 1990s and early 2000s were in favor of reincorporating Eritrea, but TPLF and EPRDF. So again, it's not about, you know, I certainly see that they had an interest to control and to certainly after 2000 to contain Eritrea, to make it irrelevant, which we saw they were quite successful in doing. But now there is something else coming back in Ethiopian politics. When TPLF is out of power, you see a lot of those who have read Ethiopian history and who have studied Ethiopian history for not only modern times, but going back. You see a new discourse again, embracing Eritrea and talking about the relationship to Eritrea in a very different manner. And I'm not to judge this in a normative manner. I'm just observing it and saying that, you know, again, it might be a fair position, political wise, that certain political elites in Ethiopia see the interest for a much more intimate relationship. I can certainly see objectively that this will economically benefit both countries, yes. Socially, it will benefit both countries if it is a much more interconnectedness, because people are split. The Afars are split, the Highland, the Tigrinians are split, the Kunamas are split, the Sahos are split, and so on. Employment-wise, you know, with the traditional migration labor across the border, this have a lot of benefits that the relationship between the two countries are much, much closer. But when you cross over into talking about Eritrean independence as a construct which is not viable, Eritrean independence as a construct which is not desirable, the infamous statement by Dina Mufti, the Minister of Foreign Affairs spokesperson in Ethiopia, saying that every Eritrean regret independence, every non-Eritrean celebrate 24th of May, you have a totally different conception of what Eritrea should be in relationship to Ethiopia. Then we come very close to, yes, that rhetoric when, as some argue, that Eritrea is the lost child and needs to come back to its mother, the motherland. And when that is spoken by key political decision makers in Ethiopia today, and you don't have any reactions from Asmara, you don't have any counter statements from Isaias or the government of Eritrea saying that, no, well, stop a bit, don't go that fast. Yes, we agree of a closer collaboration. We agree of a closer, framework agreement on trade and currency and migration, but we're not talking about giving up sovereignty here. We don't hear that. So we don't know what Isaias is thinking. We don't know what the decision-making processes are in Eritrea when it comes to these very, very crucial issues, which the Eritrean people has sacrificed tens of thousands of lives to achieve, might now be squandered away. We don't know. And that's what makes the current situation very fragile. And certainly so when the bilateral relations are not institutionalized, when the bilateral relations are personalized between Isaias and Abiy, this becomes even more scary.
That's really interesting that you've mentioned, because historically, even during the independence fight, Isaias has unilaterally just made a lot of decisions that cost many, many, many Eritrean freedom fighters. And then after the war is over and independence and sovereignty comes in, has made a unilateral decision to go into war, had literally annihilated the parliament or the cabinet. And now we don't see any head of states really making decision. The Eritrean people are kept in the darkness. So there is a lot of information scarcity and flat out literally spreading propaganda and untrue information, which leads to my next question is, and I'm going to express this in a way that it is very personal to me, in a sense that many of my family members are conscripted into the indefinite national service. So when I see and hear the injustice happening in Tigray, and I have a lot of Tigrayan friends, I feel so hurt for them, because it was us 20 years ago, and let alone our dear neighbors. I wouldn't want strangers to go through the same experience that we went through. So I think an average sane Eritrean really doesn't want to see that happening to Tigrayan people. However, when people just kind of flat out start demonizing the army, I kind of say, wait, that's my cousin who's conscripted, that's sent there, whom we don't know is alive or dead, right? A lot of numbers come out of like the killing, a lot of like the massacre. And I will go ahead and admit, TPLF and EPRDF, and now the Prosperity Party, as well as the Eritrean regime, and you can witness to this, are notorious for controlling information, right? That comes out from the region, which leads to a room of a lot of speculation and unverified news that comes out. Now, in order for the world to really set the stage and understand what's happening, and also identify the Eritrean army as victims of Isaias's agenda, how do you develop the discernment of finding true information? Because when it's kind of like difficult for us as Eritrean to be sad with the Tigrayan people and also see our brothers who are victims of this situation. So you kind of go back and forth, and you're just left at stranded and say, what's happening? You know, like when I hear about the looting and the destruction. And I remember in 1998, like TPLF was publishing articles saying bombs and explosives were found in Ethiopian families. Youth were collaborating with the PFDJ to undermine. They're exploiting Ethiopian wealth, and Ethiopians were eating that. And it's sad that these people lived among them and they were quick to believe this false information that's being perceived. So I have a really skeptical, or I just kind of look at everything with a grain of salt of any information that comes from the region. You know, even if it is like, if it meets my agenda of vilifying Isaias, which I'm willing to believe on everything, but I do have to develop the discernment of like, which one is factual, what's really happening. So tell us, like, what are some of the discernments that you're currently using to really understand and qualify the issues and real victims that are really coming out of Tigray, as well as the victims who are the Eritrean soldiers who are being perceived in the world, these monstrous, bloodthirsty people who are our family members. So if you can share a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's crucial what you are pointing at, and it's a huge challenge. It's a double or triple tragedy unfolding, in a sense. The killings of civilian Tigrayans by Eritreans who are forcefully conscripted into an army to do a job they most likely don't want to do. So they are victimized on both sides. Both the victims and the perpetrators are victims, in a sense, if I can phrase it like that. And of course, the tragedy again that the people-to-people relationship between the people of Eritrea and Tigray is once again set back many years. I did a long-term research project together with friends or colleagues in Tigray, at the universities in Tigray, on the border between Eritrea and Tigray from the years leading up to 2018. And I also crossed into Eritrea a couple of times, to talk to Eritreans directly on that. And you saw intense interest and need from the grassroots, from the villages, that we want to come back together again. Because we are families, we are intermarried, we went to each other's funerals, we went to each other's marriages, weddings, we interacted on a daily basis, and we have been separated by this nonsense Cold War for 20 years. And you saw the enormous jubilations after the opening of the border in the fall of 2018. Sadly enough, it was soon closed again, just 3 months later, by Isaias. I think there are so many stories, there are so many narratives explaining or trying to understand this war, and you need to try to empathize with all of them to get the fuller understanding of the picture. I think it benefits me enormously, the fact that I had been living in Eritrea, in the villages of Eritrea for many years, and I've been visiting Eritrea for over a 10 years period, because I'm not allowed to go back again after the 2000 war, and because of my critical writings on Isaias-Abiy, on the human rights situation internally Eritrea, they're not allowing me to come back to continue my research. I actually asked, when the 1998 war broke out, I applied for a research permit to go back to my village in Eritrea to see how the new war were perceived, but that was denied. So again, you can say a blessing in disguise, because I ended up doing fieldwork on the Tigrayan side, in close to the conflict, to the front line, to see how the Tigrayans understood this new war, and which makes me capable to relate to and empathize on both sides here. I understand the sufferings, I understand the plight and the dire situation in Eritrea among the Eritrean people. And I know how they are recruited to the army. I know what they go through in that system. I know how the public indoctrination of the society in Eritrea when it comes to information and access to information and use and different kind of interpretations than the government propaganda over the last 25 years. And at the same time, I have also a deep attachment to the Tigrayan people, having been working there for 30 years and being there very closely on the ground for many, many years, both during war and after. And I know that kind of sentiment very well too. So I think for me, methodological wise, trying to untangle all this, trying to untangle all the lack of information or untangle the disinformation, the propaganda from the both government sides and from all political actors' side, and then try to go down to the grassroots to listen to the individual voices on the ground. What are they saying? What are they feeling? How are they perceiving it? How do they explain it? What kind of relationship do they see are recast by this war? And luckily, since I have published quite a lot over almost 30 years now, people in both Eritrea and Ethiopia at large and Tigray knows me, and many people send me information. You know, some of the only some few days, 10 days after the war broke out, people in Senafe contacted me saying there is fighting on the Salambesa front line. We see Eritrean troops are moving. You know, why do we engage in this war when it started in 4th of November? So I knew immediately that Eritrean forces were part of the war because of Eritrean friends and contacts in Eritrea, inside Eritrea, telling me this. And when they are sitting there in the field, giving me information, and that information is triangulated with a number of other people in the same locality or in the vicinity or on the other side of the border, you start to see a pattern. You can then try to analyze based on that. But certainly it is difficult since the news media are blocked, international media are blocked, diplomats are blocked. Now you have some humanitarian workers on the ground. And of course, obviously the best thing would be to be there in person, which is difficult right now. But I was in Tigray and on the Eritrean border in Salambesa last time in late September last year. So it is not that far off. But it is it demands from a methodological perspective, doing research, it demands a more nuanced approach, and you need to be triangulating the current information. But the current information, the current sentiment, again, in my short lifetime as a researcher, this is the third war I'm studying in this locality. This is the third big war I'm studying in this locality. And of course, you can draw on the history here. I have experiences with the War of Liberation in Eritrea. I have experiences with the War of Resistance, the Woyane. I have experience from the 1998-2000 war. I've been there throughout. So I build on kind of a lot of prehistory here, which I used also to interpret what's happening today, because it is anchored in these earlier narratives.
That's really touching to hear that. I'm sure it's really a little bit painful for you as well to see the birth of a new nation and then really cut their own arm and leg to really end up into another third war, devastating the poor, villagers and individuals, because I think the war cost is to the villager, to the farmer, to the young, not necessarily the head of states, who are really not merely impacted, but rather their ego stroke. Unfortunately, the Horn of Africa is plagued for conflict in that. And when I say Horn of Africa, that also includes Sudan and other parts of the region. The other part that I wanted to include is that how realistic do you imagine the Eritrean troops withdrawing? Initially, we saw the complete denial of the regime, as well as the Ethiopian Prosperity Party really remaining in silence, and the diaspora supporters of Isaias-Abiy absolutely flat out denying, when we're just hearing even leadership in Ethiopia saying, hello, they're here, you know, and in the same way as you would verify with family members who went there, who call us, who contact us and say, we are here. And for them, it's like, we're just looking at this opportunity for us to escape Eritrea and never return, for them to realize that's not a possibility. So how realistic do you think is the withdrawal of Eritrean troops from Ethiopia? Do you think it is something that could realistically happen? If so, would there be a third-party verification, or would they further go into the integration of the Ethiopian army to further expand the agenda of Isaias-Abiy and Abiy Ahmed?
Yeah, I so wish it was true. I so desperately wish it was true, both to save Eritrean lives, but certainly also to save Tigrayan lives, that the troops would be withdrawn. I don't believe it 1 second. Basically because to understand the moves of Isaias and Abiy, you have to think like Isaias and Abiy. And Isaias is actually rather easy to interpret, because he is one of the most shrewd political operators that has ever existed. And his only aim is survival for himself and his idea of a warrior nation, so to say. Abiy is a bit more difficult to analyze, since he has a more erratic and at times irrational behavior, based more on religious beliefs than political realities. And he has apparently not as good an understanding of the context of his own country, of the history, of the empirical reality, of the wars, and the different positioning of the people. Amazingly enough, being a soldier himself one time ago. So, but the reason why Eritrean troops will not be pulled out is then the Tigrayan defense forces will take territorial control of Tigray, most of Tigray. It is the Eritrean troops who are the backbone of the fighting force in Tigray, supported obviously in cohort with the ENDF, the federal forces, and Amhara militia in certain parts of Tigray, the west and the south. So if Eritrean troops are pulled out, you will see a radical shift of terrain rather quickly. And I don't think neither Isaias nor Abiy have that on their plan, so to say. Certainly not before the rainy season. So until the rains comes, you will see more and intensified fighting. And that's what we hear from the ground. That's what we hear. We hear of Eritrean troops deployment, reinforcement sent over the border. Not Eritreans pulling back to Eritrea, but the opposite is happening. So, and again, as I try to tell naive diplomats, you know, just listen to what Isaias says or what he doesn't say, and look at the statements emanating from Asmara. Usually they are kind of head on, if there are any statements. Isaias have kept quiet. He hasn't acknowledged Eritrean troops are in Tigray. He hasn't acknowledged they will be pulled out. But you saw the statement from Charlie, from Yemane Gebremeskel, Minister of Information, after Abiy said that Eritreans should pull out. No, the Eritrean statements was quite the opposite. We're going to intensify our struggle to meet the challenges. How do you interpret that? Is that pulling out? No, it's throwing more troops in to try to crush the Tigrayan resistance. So sadly, that will not happen. What might happen, in order for Abiy to avoid the international pressure and possible sanctions, which are now discussed in US and EU, is that the Eritrean troops will be rehatted. They will be merged and integrated into the Ethiopian army. And we already have information from the ground now that Eritrean troops are uniformed in ENDF uniforms, for instance. And then you might have a defense pact formalized, where it says that the two governments have a common security interest, merged part of their armed forces. which makes it impossible for internationals to criticize it, because it is, you know, it's two sovereign states. If they enter into defense pact and want to have a joint army, it's very little one can say about that. And possibly that's what's coming out. And that again is also one step further to, you know, that's one chip off Eritrean sovereignty. When, if, I'm not saying we do have information, it is already happening, but it has to be collaborated further. But if Eritrea gives away a large part of its army under Ethiopian command, certainly that is also undermining Eritrea's sovereign capacity.
I couldn't agree more. I think Isaias is exactly what you described him. He's not a patriot, or there is no this granular of description how he bleeds for Eritrea or Ethiopia. He's a shrewd narcissistic man who has an agenda and has very lucrative relationship. There hasn't been a single relationship that has been built with Isaias and that was lasting. So that goes to the question of, where is this bromance going between Abiy Ahmed and Isaias-Afwerki? And I think sometimes, you know, when the 2018 peace agreement came, I was really optimistic, had a very a hopeful thought with this young prime minister who really advocate for good things that I want to hear, right? We do want a very prosperous and successful Ethiopia, as well as Eritrea, as independent states and neighboring states that respect each other, but socially and economically benefit from each other. But that respect of standing alone has to be implemented and understood by both parties. So I was really quite taken by his literally almost gluing himself to the most toxic man in the region. This has really been a reason for the war in Yemen, or facilitated the war in Yemen, has fought with Djibouti, with Ethiopia, with Sudan, and his own people. I mean, do you know a single state that has not in the region that hasn't had a conflict with this man? So I'm quite confused by the naiveness of Abiy Ahmed, who really, I don't know, have failed to see who this person is. And also, what are they each benefiting from each other? And do you see this as an ending relationship soon that will really come to a very explosive ending that could put both Ethiopian and Eritrean people in danger?
No, I agree. I think yes, everyone was happy the first month Abiy came to power and put in motion reforms. More or less all the reforms Abiy put in motion were decided by EPRDF the year earlier at the Congress of 2017. So he didn't invent it, but he implemented it, and which is great what he did, both domestically and also in relation to Eritrea. But I have to admit I was skeptic from day one when it comes to the peace agreement with Eritrea, because is it one person in the world you cannot trust? It is Isaias. Isaias is only a transactional politician. He's purely transactional. And as long as it benefits him, that transaction is ongoing. When it's no longer benefiting him, that relationship is broken. That's what we have seen. So and quite early on, you also, you know, I keep a benefit of doubt that Abiy Ahmed was basically just naive entering into the relationship the way he did. I think he intended good to a certain degree. Of course, he also at the same time needed the help of Isaias and Eritrea to further marginalize TPLF from power. Because remember, in the transition of Ethiopia in 2018, TPLF, when they lost the vote in the EPRDF Congress about which candidate should take up the chairmanship of the party, TPLF voted for a candidate from the southern Ethiopian party. in order to continue kind of that tradition from Haile Mariam, where you have a more of a symbolic figurehead as party leader and the real power rests at a different level. When they lost that vote, you have to keep in mind that TPLF more or less controlled the security, the intelligence, and the armed forces in Ethiopia. They could have stated coup d'etat at that time, inner coup d'etat, so to say. They could have stopped the process, but they didn't. They accepted the vote in the first round, and that vote was reconfirmed in the May meeting, where all the TPLF members also voted for Abiy, reconfirming his position. And they accepted a transition. It was not stopped or blocked, which they could potentially have done. So we have to give them some grace on that issue, actually, which is often overlooked when you interpret that first months of transition. And then, but very early on, already in June, before Isaias accepted the olive branch offered by Abiy Ahmed, Abiy came out very early in his first parliamentary speech, saying that we wanted to have peace with Eritrea. Isaias kept quiet, didn't comment on it at all. For 6 weeks, no comments. And everybody was, why isn't anything happening in Asmara? And my interpretation is, and we, together with also colleagues who have dug into that, is that Isaias sent signals to Abiy saying that I don't trust you because TPLF is still around. TPLF is still head of intelligence. TPLF is still head of the armed forces. You are just a puppet like Haile Mariam. So after Abiy removed Getachew Assefa as head of intelligence and Samora as head of the chief of staff, that's when Isaias came forward and said, okay, I believe it is a genuine shift of power in Addis. It's the same party, but it's a shift of power within the party apparatus, the fractions. So I can relate to this guy. He's an Oromo, he's not a Tigrayan. And TPLF has certainly been pushed out of some of the offices. So let me join Abiy and help him to further marginalize TPLF. And Abiy needed that help in that month. And you saw quite...
Why do you think that he needs that help? That's the a little bit of unclear that for me, looking as an outsider in Eritrean, your Tigrayan people are closer to you than an outsider Eritrean. I mean, when you look at it from logical perspective,
but
how the relation to Isaias is more important than to get on the table and discuss with the TPLF?
Because Abiy was brought to power basically by the Cairo protest movement, by the Oromo youth movement, who destabilized the country since 2015. Abiy was brought to power on a kind of an Oromo ticket initially. And the Oromo ticket was cut TPLF back to size, get them out of Addis, get them back where they belong, to Tigray. Addis is Finfinne, we should control Addis. But because of the extreme control TPLF had of the security forces and the armed forces and the system, the apparatus of the state, Abiy needed to consolidate from all positions. Yes, the Amhara bloc joined him because they had a common interest at that time also to push TPLF out. And certainly Isaias, he needed certain security guarantees possibly, but also other external relations to further marginalize the TPLF officials from Addis. And that's what you saw immediately after Isaias accepted the peace process. You have certain statements from Abiy, which are then starting to target Tigrayans, and not only TPLF, but Tigrayans more generally. In July, August, and so on, his visit to US and his speeches in US was certainly noteworthy in this regard. So then you did have, but you know, we knew for sure that the alliance, the bromance between Abiy and Isaias was beyond transitioning Ethiopia, so to say, but was more directly targeted to TPLF and Tigray after, certainly from the point of view of Isaias-Abiy. That came clear both through his statements and actions, the game over rhetoric, the daytime hyenas rhetoric, all this indicated that he still had the axe to grind with TPLF, that he still wanted to pursue the war with TPLF. And when Isaias closed the border again in December 2018, you remember it opened on the 20th of September. You had the border opening and it closed again on 30th of December, if I remember correctly. We knew for sure that this was just a new phase leading up to a new war, basically. And that's when I started to write about this and published articles about that this process is, not discrediting, separating what's happening, domestic reform in Ethiopia, from the peace process with Eritrea, that the peace process was more a pragmatic tool to continue the war against TPLF in a different manner. So I was never a great optimist, I have to say. I think I've become possibly too cynical, having worked in the area for so long, and the politicians have failed over and over and over again in their promises to deliver peace and reforms and democracy. So I don't trust anyone, basically, in what they're saying, and nobody should. You should look on what they're delivering on the ground instead. And then coming to your question, sorry for this long prelude here, but just that's explaining the background. How long will this bromance last? You asked, what's next in this relationship? And I think we've already seen it's starting to wither. The bromance is starting to wither. And you certainly see that from various Ethiopian actors. Already in December, you had ENDF officials criticizing Eritrean troops on the ground in Tigray, based on a sovereignty issue, as looked from Ethiopia, that these are actually foreign forces on Ethiopian soil, waging a war against our citizens. These were people not caught up in the political elite, so to say. They were more army officers of integrity, questioning the existence of Eritrean troops in Ethiopia, without the government recognizing it. You have had statements now also from other political elites that the Eritreans and particularly the looting of historical sites, churches, the destruction of Ethiopian history conducted by Eritrean troops, have also started to ferment something else in an Ethiopian discourse. That is this really needed, so to say? Can we really support this? This is not Tigrayan history. This is Ethiopian history being destroyed in front of our eyes. So I think it's seen from, and that's when also the objectives of the two head of governments are starting to, be separating. Isaias still have an interest to fight the war in Tigray because TPLF is not dead. Isaias will continue until TPLF is dead or he himself is dead. It's kind of nothing in between.
The part that's a little bit, I wouldn't want to say confusing, but lack of clarity. If, okay, you have now invaded a part of Ethiopia, however, you still, do they really pose a real threat to him? Is that fear or using a war to stay in power, right? I think a 1998 war wasn't just purely only a disagreement between Meles and Isaias. Rather, Isaias was also facing some serious pressure internally to make change. People are saying, you're not going to run this country like kingdomship, and you are the ultimate voice. This is a democratic country that we would like to run election to. So internal pressure was coming. So it was a perfect timing. So I'm thinking, is this another excuse of Isaias as war being an excuse to prolong his stay and continue to get more support? You know, unfortunately, as you can see it, even very astute, critical people of Isaias are being more quiet and kind of siding with him in this part, because we've seen a very naive and short-sighted Tigrayan media really demonizing our people, like talking about there's a particular people who are killing. When you see this, you automatically make all Eritreans unite together and forget the evil at home, right? So when one of us hurt, all of us hurt. So that unity just comes in, where in the time of no war, the real question of, look, you can't run this country like it's your own and create a lot of injustice. So what's his obsession? Is this like, I'm going to remain in power, so I'm going to bait that as their existence? They still continue to be a harmful entity to me, so I'm going to make that a being? Or you have a different intake on that?
I think Isaias has miscalculated this war, in the sense that I think he would have been better off not engaging in it, because after the peace agreement, even though Isaias didn't receive the Nobel Peace Prize, but he benefited greatly nevertheless in international standing. The sanctions from UN was lifted. The sanctions from US were lifted. He was welcomed back, so to say, into the brotherhood of dictators and statements in Africa and Middle East. No European state, not EU, dared to criticize human rights in Eritrea after the peace process, because they were afraid if they criticize human rights violations in Eritrea now, we are undermining the peace process. It was never a process. It was never a process. It was a deal between two head of governments. The process hasn't been the peace hasn't been institutionalized yet, as far as we know. So, but you saw it scared off and it deflected all criticism. It even went so far that, you know, the special rapporteur on human rights for Eritrea, which have been working under the UN for the last number of years, her work were discredited by European states because it endangered the peace process. So the key European states who had always favored human rights, I'm not going to name them and shame them, but I know their governments and I know it, were clandestinely undermining the work of the special rapporteur because they felt it as a nuisance. We now have to protect Isaias in a sense because the peace is so valuable. It's true, the peace is valuable, definitely. But they naively assumed that it would be peace because they naively trusted Isaias and that relationship, which certainly you should never do. So I think he would have been better off standing still and benefiting from that new support internationally. He could have received a lot of funding support also from the Europeans, and EU gave him quite a lot, which is still rejected in infrastructure programs and so on and so forth. And the international mining companies wanted to come and operate and all that. So I think, and sadly enough, the Eritrean opposition in diaspora has not been strengthened during the last years. So we didn't really have a threat from an active political diaspora. And he didn't have a threat from a domestic audience too, to a level that it made him unstable. Because over the last 20 years, the Eritreans have voted with their feet, as it says. They have left. They haven't stood up back home to fight him. And sadly, and understandably so, but that's the reality. those 700,000-800,000 youth who have left over the last 20 years, if they had been in Eritrea and gone to the streets and said no more, Isaias would have been gone. But those are in Europe and America and all over Africa, all over the world. And very understandably, I'm not criticizing individuals here. I'm just looking at the system. So, but by now engaging fully in the war in Tigray in Ethiopia, Isaias is in jeopardy to saw off the branch he's sitting on because he's sacrificing his army. And this can create a backlash in Eritrea in the times to come, when family members back home saying, where is our son and daughter? What's really happening? And the costs of all of this on society and on the demographic structure of Eritrean society. So I think actually, I'm not going to speculate, but this might be the beginning of the end of the Isaias regime, this war, which would be an irony, an ironic outcome of a situation where he would finally annihilate TPLF.
I couldn't agree more. I think he really miscalculated it. And I think early on, when there are rumors of war and things were coming up before November, I had a discussion with a friend, a fellow activist, and said, if he enters this war, it's the end of Isaias. And it's kind of now becoming more outspoken with many activists, you know, scholars and researchers and journalists that have been observing the region and studying the community. I have one question to go, and I know we're coming top of the hour, and actually two. The first one is that as an activist and a writer, what advice can you give us to help explain away the misguided statements coming from some Tigrayan medias and activists conflating the illegal action of dictator Isaias with the peace-loving Eritreans who've been under bondage over 3 decades? So when we ask this question, is that I think there's a lack of understanding from the diaspora Tigrayan community that we are also victims, right? When you isolate and you really, you know, because they're hurting as well, right? Like, and they want to pin that pain onto someone that's visible to them, which is the Eritrean people, right? And which is a very dangerous mentality, because this empowers Isaias, because all Eritreans will come together, right? And it's also for those activists who care about humanitarian action, whether it's Eritrea or even in Tigray, how do we even understand, like, is this an action happening by the Amhara people who've had years of conflict with the Tigrayan people over some regional dispute, are completely being blamed on the Eritrean troops who are forced and in Eritrea, really in a war they don't want to fight in? How do you curb that naive assessment that they think that they are making the world know what's happening, but rather losing their fellow Eritrean that sympathize and empathize with them and really share their pain, kind of pushing them out to say, wait a minute, you're demonizing our people over the action of handful people. So what some advice can you give us for those of us who really are trying to bring change in a meaningful way for each of our countries?
Yeah, it's so extremely sad to see that observation you are making. And again, I think it is for the people living in Tigray now, they are facing multiple enemies. And we know that there are just horrendous atrocities taking place against the civilian population on a daily basis across Tigray. And for them, this is war. And what war does is that it creates a black and white impression of the world. You have those who are with us, and all the others are enemies, so to say, against us. You don't have any nuances. You don't have any shades of gray. You don't have any, you don't have the luxury or capacity to say that this Eritrean soldier and I'm sorry I have to say this Eritrean soldier who killed my brother or who raped my sister is also caught under the same plight that I am in terms of political suppression. And he's not doing this because he wants to do it, but he's doing it for his own survival, because it is his order. That is not the luxury the Tigrayans in Tigray have. So, because that's the reality. They are trying to survive, and they're seeing their closest being killed. But I think it rests, because of that, it rests even more responsibilities to the Tigrayans and Eritreans and Ethiopians at large in diaspora to help create those nuances, and not the opposite, as we typically see that the diasporas or segments of the politicized diasporas are more agitators for war than mitigators of peace. That they sit in their safe houses, wherever they are in Europe or US, and say, go and kill, go and take revenge, destroy. They are not sacrificing anything. It's the people on the ground who are suffering. On both sides, on all sides. Amharas too is suffering tremendously in parts of Ethiopia today, in Wolga and other parts. Amharas are insecure. But at the same time, the Fano and Amhara militia are fighting and killing Tigrayans, also in Tigray. So it is multiple contradictions involved in this terrible situation Ethiopia is in and Tigray is in. And I think it rests upon everyone, to the best of our abilities, to try to mitigate, to try to analyze, to try to nuance this chaos, and not the opposite. And the war rhetoric, the hate rhetoric is intense in Ethiopia these days, and also then projected against Eritreans. I'm not excusing all Eritreans. I'm excusing the rank and file to a large degree, in the sense that they are under plight. But the Eritrean officer corps, we know they are part and parcel of the suppressive regime. Most of them, not all, but most of them. So you have a chain of command up to the top, Isaias, which are responsible for the atrocities in Tigray, and which are responsible for the atrocities in Eritrea, for the human rights violations in Eritrea, which are ongoing as we speak too. There's no freedom in Eritrea when you're fighting the war in Tigray. You're still under the same suppressive authoritarian regime, and don't think it will be freedom after the war in Tigray is over. The suppressive authoritarian regime of Isaias-Abiy will continue. So this war should rather be against your own suppressive regime instead of against a neighboring guy, in my view. But that's an ideal world, and we're not there yet.
Yeah, I think I'll conclude today's conversation. It's been really beautiful. I can sit here and talk to you hours and hours. You have a lot to share. But what advice would you give to the Eritrean diaspora who really wants to advocate for its people? Right? It's people, when I say not only the Eritreans who are really under the regime oppression, but also for the refugees stranded in Tigray, right? Like they too have been victims of all sides, right? The angry Tigrayan people, the Amhara people, and the Eritrean regime as well. They've been getting cherry-picked in Addis and in Libya. They're really everywhere else. So as an Eritrean diaspora and a lot of young people like myself, what advice do you give that we can set the international community to understand what we are facing and be able to leverage those relationships to bring about change?
No, I agree. It's terrible to think about the plight of the Eritrean refugees in Tigray these days. We don't know where many of them are and if they are alive, and under which conditions they are living. It must be horrendous what they are going through too. And many of them are kids, are children. Also keep that in mind. So it's very, very tough to think about their plight. I think, you know, what you and what, again, it's nothing different from what you should do, than I should do, than we all should do, is to try to enlighten the public debate the best we can, to try to feel empathy and solidarity also for the sacrifices and the sufferings of our adversaries, because they are ordinary people too, suffering here, although how hard that can be. I fully understand that too, but try to look upon the situation from different perspectives than your own, and certainly try to organize, and that's directly to the Eritrean diaspora and Eritrean political organizations in diaspora. You need to come together to provide an alternative for the current regime in Eritrea. You need to hammer out a platform of consensus, of saying this is Eritrea. We are representing Eritrea, not the jerk in Asmara. And this is the vision for the new Eritrea we need to work to realize, all of us, and then bind that back home, so to say, ground it back home, and get the change needed from within Eritrea by removing the current regime and to open up for reforms.
I couldn't agree more. I think you're pretty much speaking music to my ears, which is, you know, I'm a little bit frustrated with the diaspora for not being able to bridge their differences and come together. And I think we really don't need another revolution to overthrow Isaias. I think his own people with him are fed up with it. But they need to see an alternative of Isaias. So I think that comes in from unity among each other, right? As one Eritrea. Yesterday, I was having a discussion on a different media, which I expressed is that historically, Eritrea had really suffered on resolving its own internal issue by involving outside forces, right? When the English decided Eritrea can't stand on its own, it gave the birth of Mohammed Andinet, which is a majority of the Highland people in Eritrea, which is predominantly Christian Orthodox and few Muslims, who wanted to be with part of the Orthodox king, and later to deceive them to realize that he had no intentions or of a prosperous and independent Eritrea, but his own greedy intentions. Later on, the same way with EPLF attacking ELF with collaboration of TPLF, which is an outside body of an Eritrea, and now really resolving to do the same issue, is that I think the solution is among us, which is to come together and having a dialogue among each other and show our unity. And the rest is really removing a few individuals. There is no need to go to war to remove Isaias. The soldiers are ready to throw their guns and become husbands, family people, farmers, educators, engineers, doctors. Everyone has been really looking for the birth of a new Eritrea, but the diaspora can't seem to come together. So I absolutely agree in your conclusion, but thank you so much.
Thank you for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. I hope this won't be the last time. We will.
Anytime.
A lot of people have really submitted a lot of questions, and we hope to invite you again and be available for us as well.
I want to send my wishes and blessings to all Eritreans back home in Eritrea, and particularly if anyone from my village area can hear or listen to this, I'm thinking of you guys all the time, and I'm longing for the day I will be back to visit Eritrea again and to visit all my friends there.
That's really a beautiful message. That would give them a lot of hope to understand that you're thinking about them as well as we are too. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you
for your time. Absolutely.
Thank you.
يأكل نبل كلنا نسلامنا يأكل نبل كلنا نحكن قوامنا يأكل نبل كلنا ونعبيتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا وهدتنا كلنا يأكل نبل كلنا قرعتنا زقرم